Gangsters, Sandstorms, and the Big Sad. It's time to take a look at the top 10 unusual things that happened in the Great Depression. Number 10. Not a drop. The stock market crashed back in April of 1929 and sent the whole world for an economic downspin. Thousands of people lost their jobs, businesses, and better way of living, with spending and investing at an all-time low. Even banks went under. In such a stressful time and after a long day's work, assuming there was work, you'd want an adult beverage just to take the edge off. Trouble for Americans in the early 30s was prohibition was still in place, meaning the legal sale of alcohol was banned. The purchase of bootleg alcohol was also difficult to many working class Americans, unable to afford the steep prices. While prohibition is widely considered to be a defining moment of the 1920s, it had effects in the 30s as well. Prohibition dissolved the brewing industry. Oh, and the irony of dissolving a whole industry only to rely on said industry a decade later. Number 9. I love this part of town. When the country is experiencing the worst economic disaster since ever, it's a good idea to distract the people you love from the impending doom with some board games. How about a board game displaying the capitalist greed that fuels the impending doom we face in real life? Yep, that's right. When Monopoly was first created, it was called the landlord's game, eventually becoming the family-destroying Monopoly we all love or hate today. Players rolling dice, charging other players exorbitant rent on slum properties, and the American classic of dodging taxes and jail time for not paying said taxes. Considering how close Monopoly was to what living and real estate issues were at the time, it's surprising how successful it became. Now, only if we had a board game where you wait in an unemployment line. Number 8. Dirty 30s. As the decade went on, things seemed to get even worse, as there weren't just hard times in the city, but in the agricultural sector as well. Wheat prices had increased during the late 1910s due to demand from the First World War. Farmers tried to capitalize on this by plowing more land to increase their profits, but once the market crashed, and so did wheat prices, making farming of wheat crops not even worth harvesting, and a lot of times were just left to rot, making starving people in cities even hungrier. To make matters worse, a drought had been affecting farmland since 1931, with furious dust storms that destroyed good crops, seeping its way into homes where it had to be shoveled like snow. It even left layers of dust on food and people, which in some cases made people sick. The federal government did try to put on new policies in place in order to assist struggling farmers. However, some areas' environments did not recover for many years after the Depression had ended. Number 7. An angry man with a mustache. The Great Depression sounds like a ton of fun, right? So far we've talked about famine, bad economy, and a board game that simulates what it's like to be a slumlord. What could possibly make this economic disaster any worse? Well, if you guessed the most destructive conflict in human history, you'd be right. During the 1930s, America wasn't the only country to feel the woes of the Great Depression. Germany felt that pain probably more than anybody else. Tough conditions from the Treaty of Versailles made Germany turn to history's most infamous mustache man. A rapid militarization, fueled by a recovering economy, was concerning for Allied nations. Even more concerning was how a very powerful country like Germany was cozying up with other nations with similar extreme right-wing politics. As the Axis powers were being formed and nations began to prepare for war, the heart of American industry began to pump, and in 1939 the Second World War began. That's right, a war brought us out of the Depression. Oh, the humanity. Number 6. Here's looking at you, kid. We might love movies like The Avengers, Star Wars, and even the best movie ever made, 2019's Cats. But back in the Depression, movies with color and audible dialogue were new and unusual to most. Movie theaters were not priced for people suffering from the Depression. Up until the 1930s, movies were silent and often had title cards for audiences to read when important dialogue was required. Needless to say, that isn't that effective in storytelling. So when movies like Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind came out, it's no wonder they were Oscar-winning contenders. I also couldn't forgive myself if I didn't mention the same thing was happening to cartoons. Having similar issues in the early 1920s with no sound, cartoons exploded with popularity thanks to color and famous characters like Mickey Mouse and Betty Boop, making for the golden age in American animation. Number 5. Good soup. Enter Al Capone, the most infamous Italian mobster who ever lived. Al Capone rose to power in Chicago through the lucrative sale of alcohol during Prohibition, making his bank accounts well endowed. Using violence and fear every step of the way to climb the criminal underworld, he was a force to be reckoned with. And also apparently had good soup. Yeah, the most violent criminal in America had a soup kitchen during the Great Depression to feed hungry poor and the unemployed. Capone would even come down to the soup kitchen sometimes to meet and greet people, where he was treated like a celebrity. The soup kitchen not only fed thousands, but also employed a few people, actively trying to solve the economic crisis that was at hand. This did have ulterior reasons, as Capone was under scrutiny for a rap sheet longer than the Great Wall of China. It was understood this would aid his public image, thus making him look better in a court of law. Not sure how soup covers up violent crimes, but hey, if it works, it works. Number 4. Keep the change, you filthy animal. The amount of organized crime in the Great Depression was unusual to say the least. While Al Capone was the most violent and ruthless gangster of his time, he was not the only one. Many other crooks, cops, and everyday people were involved. After Prohibition had ended, criminals moved on to other enterprises like narcotics, brothels, gambling rackets. But what made organized crime so dangerous was the level of corruption they were able to achieve. Judges, politicians, and everyday people would all receive kickbacks for aiding these criminal enterprises. It was difficult to not take bribes when the economy was so tough, and people just needed to get by. After all, not taking the bribes may just wind you up with a new pair of shoes, the kind that keeps you underwater. Gabish? Number 3. Hooverville. When the savings account dries up and you lose your home, you need to find shelter. This was a hard truth for many Americans in the 1930s. People living in cities and urban centers were forced out of their homes and forced to build shantytowns, often referred to as Hooverville, named after President Hoover, for his lack of support during the economic crisis. There were dozens of Hoovervilles across America, consisting of loose metal and really whatever people could get their hands on. But these communities held on. A Hooverville in St. Louis is notable for being so large it had its own districts and an unofficial mayor. Not sure how you separate a town of shacks into districts. Maybe by who has more dirt and mud in their district? Number 2. Live reality TV. While TVs did exist in the 1930s, they were a new technology and crazy expensive. But how did Americans get their fix of the hottest reality TV, you may be asking? Well, my couch surfing friends, the answer to that is dance marathons. When people wanted to have fun that had dangerous potential, you went to witness a dance marathon. Watching competitors compete for cash prizes took a new meaning in the Depression, as they also offered shelter and a large amount of food for any normal person at the time. If your knees touched the floor, you were disqualified. So when dance partners needed to sleep, because yes, they lasted days, they would tie themselves to each other in order to keep them from falling. Eventually, these marathons fell out of style and were banned. Good thing too, because this sounds like the beginning of a weird Hunger Games where you'd have to like jazz hands your enemy to death. Number 1. Pole sitting. Well, I'll be Barbara, bring everybody outside. That has to be the most interesting thing I have ever seen. The dance marathons at least had a prize at the end. People did this for pride? Pole sitting would draw in large crowds. In 1930, 20,000 people came out to see Alvin Kelly sit, eat, and shave on top of a pole for what must have been a very windy 49 days. I cannot believe he spent 49 days up there. That wraps up today, guys. Make sure to comment, like, and subscribe. I've been your host, Andrew Castonguay, aka Big Ched, and I'll see you soon. So long. Number 3. Try that again. What the number? What am I shouting for? Relax, calm down. It's a video, relax. And number 1, pole sitting. That's a bad title, isn't it? That's kind of a bad title. Pole sitting. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to make that bad. We can. All right.